The air on the roads above Siegerland carried that late October chill, thin and dry, the kind that settles quietly after the pubs begin to empty. On the 25th of October, 1984, Günther Stoll moved through an evening that seemed ordinary from a distance. Yet up close, small things were already out of place. A remark at a local pub, a moment of sudden realization, a few letters written down and then altered. It was not the sort of mystery that announces itself loudly. It began instead with fragments, with people trying later to remember tone, timing, and the exact shape of a note that may have read YOGTZE. From there, the case drifted outward into familiar roads, brief visits, and a drive into the night toward Hagen. Detectives would spend years doing the patient work cold cases require, tracing routes, revisiting statements, and holding uncertain details side by side. And all the while, the central questions remained surprisingly quiet. What he meant, whom he feared, and why that small written clue refused to settle. So tonight, we can sit with the file as it slowly opens, and follow the careful path by which this old German mystery went cold. The first firm detail in the file is small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. A man at a pub table, sometime in the evening, seemed suddenly struck by a thought. Witnesses would later remember him saying something like, "Now I get it." That brief remark matters because it changes the tone of the night. Before that, the evening could still be mistaken for an ordinary one. After it, investigators have to ask what exactly came clear to him, and why the clarity seemed to bring no comfort at all. Not long after, he wrote down a short sequence of letters. It is usually given as YOGTZE. But even here, in the earliest and most famous clue, the ground is unsteady. The writing was reportedly altered, crossed out, or corrected in some way. That means detectives did not receive a clean message. They received a fragment, touched by hesitation, perhaps by second thoughts, perhaps by urgency. And because the note was unstable from the start, every later theory inherited that same uncertainty. If you sit with the file long enough, you notice how often this case behaves that way. A detail appears, then blurs at the edges. A witness recalls a phrase, but not the exact tone. A stop on the route is confirmed, but not its purpose. The case does not deny investigators information. It gives them information in forms that never quite settle. Back in Anshausen, where Stoll lived, people around him had already seen signs that something was wrong. He was a food engineer, a man with a profession, routines, and the ordinary structure of adult life. But in the period before that October night, he had reportedly spoken more than once about unnamed people who were after him. That phrase, "they are after me," would become central later. At the time, though, it was only one more worrying remark in a private setting. His wife heard distress, but not a clear accusation. There was fear, but no list of names. There was alarm, but no explanation strong enough to call the whole town into motion. That is the first real difficulty in the investigation. The people closest to him could tell police that he seemed afraid. They could not tell them exactly why. So the detectives, when they began assembling the timeline, had to make an early choice. Do they treat his fear as evidence pointing outward toward a genuine threat in the world around him? Or do they treat it cautiously, as part of a state of mind that may or may not reflect a real pursuit? That decision matters because it shapes every interview after it. If the fear is anchored in reality, then the unknown pursuers become the hidden center of the case. If it is not, then the note, the movements, and the drive into the night may belong to a different kind of mystery. In the first hours, though, police could not commit fully to either path. They had too little, and because they had too little, they had to gather the night in pieces. After leaving the pub, Stoll went home. This return is important because it places him briefly back inside a familiar world. Home should have been a point of rest, or at least of pause. Instead, it becomes another place where unease is visible. He told his wife again that they were after him. The line is remembered because it is plain. No code, no symbol. Just fear, stated directly. Yet even in its simplicity, the sentence created a problem for investigators. Who were they? Friends? Colleagues? strangers, creditors, imagined enemies, some combination of these, or no one at all. A statement like that can point everywhere at once. And when a clue points everywhere, it risks pointing nowhere useful. What happened next gave the case its first clear movement. He did not stay home. He left again, got into his Volkswagen Golf, and drove into the night. That departure is the first concrete escalation, because from then on the case becomes a matter of route, distance, and missing time. A worried man is one kind of file. A worried man who writes a strange note and then drives away alone is another. Investigators now had to ask not only what he feared, but where he believed he needed to go. Road cases often begin to thin out once a route is established. You find petrol receipts, toll records, witnesses who saw the car, or family who knew the destination. This case resisted that neatness. Still, the first task was simple in principle. Trace the night. Begin in Anshausen. Move outward. See where he appears next. One of the next confirmed stops came at the home of an elderly woman he knew. Accounts differ slightly in the retelling, as old cases often do, but the visit itself stands. He arrived unexpectedly. It was late, and the call was strange enough to be remembered. There was no settled social reason for the visit. He did not arrive for a planned meal, or a clear errand, or a family occasion. He simply appeared, carrying with him the unsettled atmosphere that had already followed him from the pub and from home. For detectives, this visit offered both help and frustration. It helped because it placed him somewhere specific after leaving Anshausen. A route with fixed points is always better than a route built only from assumptions. But it also frustrated them because the stop explained very little. He did not deliver a useful message there. He did not identify the people he feared. He did not leave behind some second note that clarified the first one. He came, and then he left. That is the pattern again. A concrete moment. Then fog around it. Once that visit entered the file, investigators could begin sketching the geography of the evening more carefully. Anshausen lies in the Siegerland region, and Hagen sits farther north and west. To move in that direction at night is to leave behind the small circle of local familiarity and commit to the road. This mattered because it suggested intention. He was not merely circling the village in agitation. He was traveling. And travel implies either destination or meeting point, even if the case never revealed which. As detectives worked backward and forward through his movements, they had to think like careful map readers. How long would each segment take at that hour? Which roads were likely? What would have been the most natural route for someone driving alone in late October? Could weather or traffic have changed his path? And just as importantly, who along that route might remember seeing him? This is the slow labor cold cases depend on. Not revelation, not dramatic insight, just clocks, roads, fuel, memory, and the discipline of putting each in its place. The more they looked, the more the night seemed to contain both purpose and disorder. He had left the pub after that moment of apparent realization. He had returned home, distressed. He had made the unusual visit to the older woman, and then he continued on. That sequence does not look random, yet no step in it explains the next one clearly enough. If he had understood something in the pub, why not say what it was? If he feared pursuit, why stop at a private home without making a plain request for help? If he had a destination near Hagen, why is that destination never firmly named in the file? Each question nudged investigators towards the same conclusion. Someone, somewhere, was missing from the story, either a person who had arranged to meet him or a person who frightened him. Without that missing person, the route remained a line without an anchor. Then the case took its most troubling physical turn. Later that night, his car was found crashed near the A45 in the Hagen area. That discovery transformed the inquiry immediately. Up to that point, detectives had been tracing a man through an anxious but still private sequence of decisions. Now there was a roadside scene. Now there was a damaged vehicle. Now there was urgency. Roadside scenes often look simpler than they are. A car is present. A body or an injured driver is present. The natural first question is whether the crash itself tells the whole story. In many cases, it does. In this one, almost from the beginning, it did not. The circumstances around the discovery raised questions that made the simple explanation hard to keep. He was found seriously injured. Accounts from the case say he was without clothing. That detail, handled carefully, mattered not because of shock, but because it did not fit easily into an ordinary accident narrative. It suggested that something had happened before the crash, or somewhere else, or with other people involved. And once that possibility entered the case, the whole meaning of the road scene changed. Instead of asking only how the car left the road, detectives had to ask whether the crash had been the main event at all. Witnesses complicated the picture further. There were suggestions that others may have been present before help arrived. That possibility is one of the reasons the case has remained so persistent in public memory. A man drives into the night in fear. He leaves behind a cryptic note. He follows a route no one fully understands. Then he is found after a crash under circumstances implying that he may not have been alone. It is not dramatic in the loud sense. It is dramatic in the quiet, procedural sense. Each new fact forces the previous ones into a new arrangement. If others were present, then the drive was not simply solitary. If the roadside scene was incomplete, then the important event may have occurred earlier. If the important event occurred earlier, then every mile before Hagen became more valuable. At this point in the file, investigators had to choose their emphasis again. They could concentrate on the car as the central crime scene, examining damage, position, and timing. Or they could treat it as the last visible point in a longer chain, and focus on the human contacts that might have happened before the vehicle was discovered. In practice, they had to do both. But resources, time, and memory do not stretch equally in every direction. Every hour spent reconstructing the mechanics of the crash was an hour not spent chasing possible companions. Every interview about the route risked being weakened by passing time. And time, in cases like this, is rarely neutral. It tends to favor forgetting. Still, the immediate statements had great importance. The people who found him, or came upon the aftermath, became the first custodians of the scene before the scene was even fully understood. What they saw, when they saw it, and whether they noticed any other vehicle nearby, all mattered. From those first impressions, detectives hoped to determine whether unknown men had truly been there, whether they had left in haste, and whether they were involved in whatever had happened to him before the car came to rest. This is where the case begins to narrow and widen at once. It narrows because police now know the general area where the night ends. They can search, canvass, and reconstruct. But it widens because the possibility of multiple unknown people creates a much larger field of inquiry. A solitary mystery is hard enough. A mystery with companions is harder. Companions leave motives, connections, and opportunities behind them, but only if you can identify them. And here again, the case refused to provide a stable handhold. Even the now famous note remained unresolved in the background, waiting. YOGTZE, if that was truly what the letter said, might have been a code, a place, an abbreviation, a vehicle marker, a private reminder, or nothing more than a mistaken string written under stress. Investigators could not ignore it, but neither could they let it dominate too early, because the night itself still needed to be mapped. You can imagine the file table at this stage. On one side, the pub, the remark, the altered note. On another, the house in Anshausen. The wife hearing that unnamed people were after him. On another, the unexpected visit to the elderly woman. Then the open road. Then Hagen. Then the crash site. Each point is real. What is missing are the threads between them, and so the work became a search for continuity. Police sought to establish times as precisely as they could. When had he been seen at the pub? How long was he at home? How much time passed before the unexpected visit? How long would the drive toward Hagen have taken under ordinary conditions? Where were the blank spaces large enough for a meeting, a stop, an argument, or a transfer from one location to another? This kind of timeline work can seem dry from the outside. But in old mysteries, it is often the deepest form of attention. You do not solve the case by force. You solve it, if you solve it at all, by finding the minute that does not fit. Here, there were too many minutes that did not fit. That was the trouble. By the time detectives began to compare witness statements more closely, one possibility stood out with increasing weight. If Stoll had not been alone near the end of the night, then the unknown men connected not only the route and the crash, but perhaps also his earlier fear. That would mean his statement about they were after him was not merely a worried phrase at home. It might have been the plainest thing he said all evening. But that conclusion could not be accepted without care. People under distress can speak in ways that reflect inner alarm rather than outer fact. Police had to protect themselves against building the whole case around a sentence that might mislead them. So they tested the alternatives. Could the crash and the injuries be explained without companions? Could disorientation account for parts of the scene? Could his earlier statements have no direct connection to what happened on the road? Each alternative was necessary to consider. Each one also left something unresolved. That is why the case did not settle quickly. No single explanation could absorb every fact without strain, and once a case reaches that state, it enters a slower phase. Instead of looking for the one answer that fits, investigators begin measuring which answer fits least poorly. That is a much colder kind of work. The road toward Hagen then became more than a route. It became a corridor of unanswered contact. Someone may have met him there, someone may have traveled with him there, someone may have left before the scene was fully discovered. And because those possibilities all pointed to human presence, the next practical step was unavoidable. Police had to gather statements from every witness they could reach and then place those memories against the clock, the distance, and the damaged car. The first challenge was simple to describe and difficult to solve. A witness can tell you what was seen. A witness can tell you when it seemed to happen. But once several people begin remembering the same night, the file fills with small differences, and each difference starts to matter. Some motorists describe the scene in practical terms: a damaged car, a man in severe distress, a stretch of road that only moments before had been unremarkable. Others added the detail that has never quite left the case alone: the suggestion that there had been other men nearby, or that Stoll himself indicated as much before he died. That single possibility changed the entire direction of the investigation. If there were other men, then police were not dealing only with a late-night crash. They were dealing with a disappearing group, and a disappearing group creates a very different kind of file. It means more than one person left the scene. It means more than one person chose silence. And it means the final hour of the night may have included conversation, purpose, and contact that no one ever fully recovered. Investigators had to work carefully here, because memory after a roadside event is not always clean. People notice what feels urgent first. They remember the injured man. They remember headlights, movement, confusion, the instinct to help. Details at the edge of vision can later harden into certainty or fade into doubt. So detectives began the slow work of separating what was clearly seen from what was inferred. Who saw another vehicle? Who only thought they had? Who heard words directly from Stoll? Who heard them secondhand? Who could place a time on the clock? And who was speaking more from impression than from certainty? This is the kind of sorting that never looks dramatic in retrospect. Yet it often decides the shape of an unsolved case. A mistaken recollection, if accepted too quickly, can send months of work in the wrong direction. A quiet but accurate statement, if overlooked, can leave the central truth buried in plain sight. So the file became increasingly structured around windows of time, not broad blocks of evening but narrower spans, the minutes between his unexpected visit and the drive onward, the likely travel time between known points, the period just before the crash scene entered public view. The first minutes after it did, the closer police looked, the clearer one problem became. The case did not suffer from a complete absence of movement. It suffered from too much movement without explanation. Günther Stoll had not simply vanished from one place and been found in another. He had left traces at several points: the pub, the home in Anshausen, the house of the older woman, the final roadside scene near Hagen. That should have helped. Often more stops mean more witnesses, and more witnesses mean a stronger timeline. Here, though, every added stop produced one more unanswered question. Why that place? Why that person? Why then? And most importantly, who, if anyone, joined him in the intervals? The report that he referred to men in the car, or men who had been near him, became one of the few pieces in the file that might connect fear to event. If his earlier statement about unnamed pursuers was real in an external sense, then these unidentified men might be the first concrete form that fear had taken. The thought is simple. It has guided much of the later public discussion, but police could not move from possibility to certainty without evidence that held. That evidence was difficult to secure. No names. No clear physical description strong enough to anchor a search. No confirmed license plate from another vehicle. No witness who could stand at the center of the inquiry and say, plainly, I saw these men, here is when, and here is who they were. So the investigators were left with an old and familiar cold case problem. The central fact may have been true, but it could not be made usable. That distinction matters. A fact in a file is one thing. A fact that can be acted upon is another. Police can believe that other people were likely involved and still have no practical path to identify them. And once that happens, the file begins to cool even while the mystery deepens. They looked at the road in both directions. Where could another vehicle have gone? How visible would a stopped car have been at that hour? Would someone leaving the scene have taken a direct route away, or a local road? Could nearby residents have heard engines, doors, voices? Could a service station, a rest point, or a roadside business have noticed unusual activity? These are ordinary questions. In many cases, one of them produces a brick, a remembered car, a receipt, a person seen standing under poor light but recognized later by clothing or posture. Here, no such clean break arrived. The road gave them a location. It did not give them a story, and so detectives turned again to human sequence. If the end of the night remained clouded, perhaps the middle could be sharpened. That meant revisiting each earlier interaction not as isolated oddities, but as possible preparations for a meeting. The pub remark in this light became more suggestive, not because it solved anything, but because it implied a pattern of thought. Now I get it. If he said words to that effect, then he believed some confusion had become clear. The natural question is what had become clear. A threat, a connection, a destination, an identity. Or perhaps something private and difficult to communicate, something that felt complete in his own mind but never crossed over into language others could use. Investigators could only work with what was available. They asked whether anyone at the pub knew of a dispute, whether anyone had overheard more than that one remembered phrase, whether he had received a phone call, whether he had met someone earlier in the day, whether the note had been shown to anyone before it was crossed out or altered. The answers, as far as the public record suggests, did not resolve the matter. The note remained a fragment. The remark remained a fragment. Together they felt meaningful. Separately they were too thin to carry a case. Then there was the visit to the elderly woman. That stop sat awkwardly in the timeline. And because it sat awkwardly, detectives kept returning to it. Unexpected visits are often revealing. People under pressure sometimes go toward places that feel safe, or familiar, or unjudging. They call on someone outside the immediate circle. They seek a witness, even if they do not know that is what they are doing. They put themselves in the presence of another person because being alone has become too difficult. It may have been something like that, or it may have had a more specific purpose now lost to time. Perhaps he intended to say more than he did. Perhaps he wanted to warn someone. Perhaps he wanted to steady himself before continuing. But again, the case offered no complete statement, only behavior that looked purposeful without becoming legible. This is why the timeline mattered so much. If police could not extract meaning from words, they might still find it in order. Behavior often tells its own kind of truth. A man who fears pursuit but takes no protective steps suggests one kind of explanation. A man who fears pursuit and moves between selected places suggests another. A man who makes contact with specific people before a final meeting suggests yet another. So they laid the night out carefully. Not once. Again and again. The hour at the pub, the return home, the statement to his wife, the departure, the unexpected stop, the continued drive, the final scene. At each point they asked the same modest question: what did he seem to think would happen next? That question is softer than asking what actually happened, but in difficult investigations it can be more useful. Expectation leaves traces. A person heading toward danger unwillingly looks different from a person heading toward a planned meeting. A person in panic looks different from a person carrying a private decision. Stoll's movements contained signs of distress, yes, but they also contained structure. He did not simply flee in random circles. He moved through selected points. That gave the case a thin line of intention, even if the intention could not be decoded. By now, the window between his last confirmed contacts and the discovery near Hagen had become the most contested part of the entire file. Those missing minutes were not empty. They were crowded with possibilities. A meeting might have happened there. An argument might have happened there. A transfer from one vehicle to another. A drive with companions. A stop at a place no witness later remembered. An event elsewhere, followed by the final roadside scene. Because none of those possibilities could be ruled out cleanly, detectives had to test each one against distance and time. This is where cold case work becomes almost architectural. You build structures from what remains, then you check which structures can stand. If a meeting had taken place, where could it have happened without causing the timeline to collapse? If others had been in the car, when had they entered it? Before the visit to the older woman? After? Near Hagen itself? If the car was not the main scene, how far away might the earlier event have occurred, while still allowing the vehicle to appear where it did? Each model explains something. No model explains everything. That was the case in one sentence. And because no model explained everything, police had to preserve more than one theory at once. That is one of the least comfortable states an investigation can enter. It sounds flexible. In practice, it is exhausting. Every theory competes for time. Every theory demands different interviews, different assumptions, different emphasis. And while detectives are trying to keep several explanations alive, witnesses continue to age away from precision. People forget exact times. They merge one conversation with another. They become less certain of routes they once drove without thinking. Meanwhile, the file grows thicker, but not sharper. In this case, the uncertainty around the other men was especially damaging because it stood at the point where the mystery might have become solvable. A cryptic note is difficult, but not impossible. Anxious behavior is difficult, but not impossible. A route through the night is difficult, but not impossible. Unknown companions, if identified, could have turned all three into a coherent story. They could have explained why he drove. They could have explained what he feared. They might even have explained the note. But since they were never firmly identified, every other clue was forced to speak alone. And each clue, alone, was weaker than it looked. The file would later reflect another harsh fact. Once Stoll died from his injuries, the chance to connect these fragments through first-person testimony disappeared completely. That fact had not yet fully landed in the earliest stage of the inquiry, because there is always a brief period in such cases where police still hope the injured person may provide the central answer. But as the investigation moved forward, and that possibility closed, the entire case changed character. Before his death, detectives were still trying to reach a living account. Afterward, they were trying to reconstruct the mind and route of a man who could no longer clarify a single sentence. That is the irreversible turn. And even before it arrived in full, the pressure of it could already be felt. Every witness statement became more important because it might be all that remained. Every remembered phrase gained weight. Every inconsistency became more dangerous. When a central witness is alive, confusion can sometimes be repaired. When he is gone, confusion settles into the permanent shape of the file. There was also the practical question of whether the roadside event should be interpreted as an accident in the ordinary sense. Police had to examine that carefully, not because it was the most compelling explanation, but because it was the simplest starting point. Could the crash itself account for the injuries? Could disorientation, distress, or impaired judgment explain the rest? Could the unusual features of the scene be side effects rather than signs of outside intervention? These are not cynical questions. They are necessary ones. Good investigators do not begin with the most elaborate explanation. They begin with the one that requires the fewest assumptions, and they move outward only when the facts insist. In the YOGTZE case, the facts did insist, but not decisively enough. The crash by itself did not seem to answer everything. Yet the alternative, some prior encounter involving others, also lacked the hard supporting detail needed to close around a suspect. So the file took on that peculiarly unresolved shape. Too strange for a simple road case, too thin for a chargeable homicide theory, too human to abandon, too uncertain to solve. If you imagine the detectives at this stage, you do not imagine sudden breakthroughs. You imagine paper spread across desks, maps, witness names, travel estimates, crossed out notes, questions written in margins, perhaps a list of possible roads north and west, perhaps a list of names from his work and social life, perhaps the 6 letters, or 5, or 6 altered into something else, copied again and again in the hope that repetition might reveal a pattern. This is the patient middle of the investigation, where the public often sees only mystery, but the police see labor. And labor, in old cases, is its own kind of care. They would have considered whether the unidentified men were connected to Stahl personally, or whether they belonged to some more accidental contact on the road. The first option points toward his own life. Friends, co-workers, acquaintances, business contacts, people from the local region. The second points outward, toward chance encounter, strangers, or a roadside event with no obvious prehistory. The problem was that his earlier fear pushed attention toward the first option, while the lack of named enemies kept the second alive. Again, the case divided itself. If his fear had a real basis, someone in his circle might know more than they had said, or more than they realized. If the fear did not map onto reality, then the final hours might have drawn him toward people he had not known well at all. That is why investigators had to begin examining not only the route, but the texture of his life before that night, not in a sensational way, not to turn the victim into a puzzle box, but because ordinary life is where real explanations usually begin. What kind of man was he in the weeks before the event? Whom did he see? What had changed? Was there workplace strain, financial pressure, social tension? A disagreement no one had thought important at the time, or was the most relevant fact not conflict, but withdrawal, the slow private hardening of fear that left little visible evidence behind. All of this would matter more once he was gone, because then investigators would have no choice but to ask others to speak for the spaces he could no longer fill. And the others, however sincere, could offer only partial access. A spouse hears one kind of truth, a colleague hears another, a friend at a pub hears another. No one person is given the whole interior weather of someone else's life. So the file inevitably became composite. Bits of his mind reflected in other people, bits of his route reflected in roads, bits of his intention reflected in unfinished action. For the investigators, the most painful part may have been how close the answer sometimes seemed. A short note, a spoken phrase, a direct statement that unnamed people were after him. A late-night visit, a final roadside scene with hints of others. You can feel, even now, the shape of a story trying to form. Yet each time it nears completion, one part remains out of reach. The note may not be exact, the phrase may be incomplete, the men are unnamed. The motive is unverified. The route has gaps, and so the case moves forward, but without the firm narrowing that normally follows a productive first round of witness work. Years later, people would keep returning to the same question. Who were the other men? It is a reasonable question, but inside the investigation, it was really several questions at once. Did they exist in the way later summaries imagined them? Were they present at the scene or earlier? Were they companions, adversaries, helpers, or some shifting combination not easy to label? Did they know him well? Did they know him only briefly? And if they were central, why did not one of them ever step forward in a way that held up under scrutiny? Silence can mean guilt. It can also mean fear. It can mean irrelevance. It can mean that the people involved never knew they were near a case that would become notorious later. Police had to leave room for all of that. It would have been easy, in a more dramatic telling, to decide that the unknown men must be the answer. Real investigations are more restrained. Unknown men may be the answer, or there may be one more unstable layer around a different truth. What made this case especially difficult was that the two most memorable elements, the note and the companions, were both unstable in the same way. YOGTZE was famous, but uncertain in form. The other men were memorable but uncertain in role. When the two strongest clues in a case are both blurred at the edges, the whole inquiry becomes vulnerable to drift. That drift had consequences almost immediately. As police looked for names, descriptions, and connections, they found themselves circling back to the same limited pool of facts. The route could be tested, the timings could be estimated, the known contacts could be interviewed, but the hidden center of the night remained hidden. And once a case begins repeating itself internally, even in the first phase, you can feel the future coldness starting to gather around it. Not because anyone stopped trying, because effort kept returning to the same locked doors. The file at this point was no longer about one strange event. It had become an arrangement of unresolved relationships. The relationship between the note and the road. The relationship between his fear and the unidentified men. The relationship between the crash and whatever may have happened before it. The relationship between his private life and his final movements. Every next step depended on which relationship could be clarified first, and none of them yielded easily. Then the central loss became absolute. Günther Stoll died. That fact stands quietly in the case, but it changes everything. Until then, the investigation still had a living center, however fragile. Afterward, there was no possibility of correction, no chance to ask him what he meant in the pub, no chance to place the note before him and say, "Is this the right reading?" No chance to ask who they were, no chance to ask why Hagen, no chance to ask what happened between the visit and the road. A death in an investigation always creates grief. In this kind of case, it also creates a technical wound. The single person who could have connected the fragments is no longer available. And because of that, every surviving fragment becomes more important than it would otherwise be. The note especially shifted in status after his death. Before, it might have been treated as one clue among several, a strange but perhaps secondary scribble made under stress. After, it began to look like the closest thing to a deliberate trace he had left. That is a heavy burden for 6 uncertain characters to carry. Yet the file had little choice. If the witness is gone, the handwriting becomes louder. If the route is broken, the fragment on paper starts to feel almost intentional, whether it was or not. And so detectives had to return to it with renewed seriousness. What exactly had been written? What had been crossed out? What had been corrected? What did different witnesses believe they saw? Could the sequence have been misread from the beginning? Had later retellings smoothed over an original uncertainty that was much larger than people realized? These are quiet questions, but they shape the whole legend of the case. A clue that is famous can become less reliable over time, not more. People repeat the most memorable version. The rough edges are lost. The ambiguity gets polished away. Soon, everyone knows the name YOGTZE, but fewer people remember that even the exact lettering was not stable in the first place. For police, that instability was not a side note. It was central, because every theory built on the note depends first on confidence that the note has been read correctly. If one letter is wrong, whole chains of interpretation fall apart. A place name may no longer fit, an abbreviation may vanish, a product reference may become meaningless. A registration idea may collapse. So detectives had to be careful not to love the note too much. A famous clue can pull an investigation out of balance. It can begin to feel richer than it is. And in this case, the note was already carrying more weight because the man who wrote it could no longer explain it. That is one reason the case began to cool in a very specific way. It did not go cold because there was nothing to examine. It went cold because the things that seemed most important could not be stabilized. The investigators could compare versions of the lettering. They could ask whether the sequence might refer to yogurt, to a license plate, to a location, to initials, to a company, to some private mnemonic. They could ask whether the final letters had been changed in haste. They could even ask whether what later generations repeated as YOGTZE had begun as something slightly different, something close enough to be remembered, but not close enough to be trusted. Each path led somewhere small. None led all the way. If you imagine a detective sitting with that scrap and a list of possible meanings, the work is not glamorous. It is patient. You write down one interpretation. Then you test it against what is known of Stoll's life. Would this phrase connect to his work as a food engineer? Would it connect to a road sign? Would it connect to someone he knew in Siegerland or near Hagen? Would it make sense as a vehicle marking? Would it fit a business, a farm, a warehouse, a product, a destination? And if it fits, does it fit in a way strong enough to do anything practical? That last question is always the hardest one. A clue that can be made to fit many things is often weaker than it first appears. You can make almost any short sequence of letters suggestive if you search long enough. Cold case work has to resist that temptation. It has to ask not merely whether an idea is possible, but whether it produces a real consequence. Does it identify a person? Does it fix a place? Does it generate a witness? Does it create a search that returns evidence? If not, the theory remains a possibility, and possibilities alone do not solve files. Some interpretations drifted toward the obvious sound of the first syllable. People noticed how easily yog might suggest yogurt. Given Stoll's profession, that was difficult to ignore. A food engineer writing something that sounded like a dairy product had a certain surface appeal. It seemed almost too convenient, and that was part of the problem. A connection can feel elegant while still being empty. Did he know a brand, a factory, a technical term, a client, a workplace reference that would make such a reading meaningful? Could the word fragment connect to some practical matter from his professional world? Investigators could ask those questions. But unless someone in that professional world came forward and said, yes, this is clearly linked to a known issue, the idea remained only a shape on paper. Other readings moved away from products and towards geography. Could the letters point to a town, a route, a district, a company name, a roadside sign half remembered or imperfectly written? Germany, like any country, offers many combinations of names and abbreviations that can appear tantalizing when reduced to a few characters. A detective can spend many hours moving between maps and lists, circling possibilities. But maps can encourage imagination as much as reason. A place name that looks promising must still meet the night itself. Did Stoll have a reason to go there? Can the route support it? Can a witness place him nearby? Did anyone connected to him live or work there? The file appears to have offered no single geographic solution sturdy enough to settle the matter. Then there were interpretations closer to administration than language. Registration marks, vehicle identifiers, initials, a shortened internal code. These are attractive because they suggest the note might have been intended as a practical reminder rather than a mysterious message. Perhaps he was trying to capture a plate number, perhaps a company vehicle, perhaps something seen only briefly. That would explain haste. It might even explain uncertainty in the lettering. But again, an explanation only helps if it can be used. A partial or mistaken plate from a frightened man in the middle of an unsettled evening is a difficult tool. Too many possibilities branch from too few characters, and if even one letter has been remembered incorrectly, the field widens beyond usefulness. This is how the note became both central and fragile. It invited inquiry. It resisted resolution. The more attention it received, the more its instability mattered. There is another quiet difficulty here. When a case enters public memory, a clue like YOGTZE starts to live a second life. Journalists repeat it, Readers repeat it. Later, viewers repeat it. The letters become the title of the mystery. Once that happens, the clue hardens culturally, even if it never hardened evidentially. People begin from the assumption that the note is fixed, because its fame depends on being fixed. But the police, sitting with the earliest reports, had to live with the older uncertainty. Was it exactly this? Was it nearly this? Was the crossing out meaningful? Did the alteration signal correction, confusion, or interruption? This gap between public memory and investigative caution is one reason the case has remained so difficult to discuss cleanly. The best known clue is also the clue that most needs restraint. So detectives broaden their approach. If the note would not speak clearly on its own, perhaps it could be made to speak through context. Not what does YOGTZE mean in the abstract, but what could it have meant to him on that day? That is a more grounded question. To answer it, investigators had to return to the ordinary structure of Stoll's life, his work, his habits, his acquaintances, his recent concerns, his routes through the Siegerland region, the names that would have been familiar to him but not to anyone else reading the file years later. This is where cold cases become quietly intimate. The broad mystery narrows back into daily life. A profession is no longer just a fact on a form. It becomes a possible source of vocabulary. A friend is no longer just a witness. He becomes a keeper of phrases, jokes, grudges, repeated worries, all the things that never make it onto official paper unless a crisis forces them there. A road is no longer just distance between points. It becomes a route someone knew by habit, perhaps by work, perhaps by memory. Investigators by necessity had to ask whether anything in his professional world might cast light on his fear, not because work is always the answer, but because adults often carry their most durable conflicts there. A disagreement over business, a dispute over money, a strained relationship, a failed arrangement. A practical problem that seemed trivial to outsiders but immense to the person inside it. If any such conflict existed, it might explain both the note and the sense of pursuit. Yet public summaries of the case have never produced a single confirmed workplace dispute strong enough to bear that weight. That absence matters. It does not prove there was no conflict. It means investigators were not able to turn that possibility into a verified line that solved the night. The same was true of his social life. People around him could describe concern. They could report his fear. They could say he had spoken of unnamed people, but they did not deliver the sort of concrete enemy list police always hope to find in difficult cases. No plainly identified group, no obvious feud, no simple chain of threats. And so the investigation kept drifting between outer and inner explanations. Perhaps he had real reason to fear specific people. Perhaps the fear was sincere but not tied to an actual conspiracy. Perhaps the final night involved both, a troubled state of mind and an encounter with others that made everything harder to interpret. That blended possibility is unsatisfying, but old cases often live there. They are not cleanly one thing or another. They are several things at once, crossing each other in ways the surviving evidence cannot sort out. This is one reason the YOGTZE case remains so persistent. It resists a single register. It can be told as a puzzle of letters. It can be told as a road mystery. It can be told as the story of a man in visible distress, whose fears may or may not have been grounded in external fact. Each version is partly true. None is complete. Imagine the file being reopened in thought. Not formally, but in the ordinary way investigators return to unresolved work. A detective takes the note again. Another takes the route. Another reviews witness statements about the men. Someone else goes back over Stoll's family and work background, not because a breakthrough is expected every time, but because unsolved cases invite periodic reordering. Sometimes a file grows cold, not because nothing can be done, but because what remains can only be done again, more carefully, with fewer assumptions. In those rereadings, the note probably kept dividing opinion. Some would see it as the nearest thing to intention, others would see it as a trap, a detail too unstable to support the hope invested in it. Both positions have logic. A dying or frightened man may leave the one clue that matters. A dying or frightened man may also write something that reflects only a passing fragment of thought. Without explanation, investigators have no choice but to keep both possibilities alive. There is also the matter of how stress changes writing itself. A person in distress may compress words, miss letters, shift sequence, write the beginning of one thing and the ending of another. If Stoll was anxious, hurried, or physically unsettled when he wrote, then the note may represent a damaged version of what he intended. That possibility widens the interpretive field so much that it becomes dangerous. Because if the note can be almost anything, then theory can outrun evidence very quickly. So police had to proceed in the least dramatic way possible. Start with the exact known context, start with whom he knew, then ask whether any meaning naturally emerges without forcing it. That is slower than popular speculation. It is also more honest, and honesty in a cold case sometimes means admitting that the most discussed clue may never have been decipherable. Still, the note could not simply be set aside. Its very ambiguity forced attention back to the people around him. If YOGTZE could not be solved in isolation, perhaps it could be solved relationally. Did anyone in his life use similar abbreviations? Did any company or product in his work world overlap with the letters? Did any destination on his route rhyme with that pattern? Did any acquaintance, business contact, or local place carry initials or a nickname that could collapse into something close to it? These are practical questions, but practical questions require practical records. And records grow thin as years pass. Memories soften, workplaces change, people move, businesses close. Regional references that were obvious in 1984 begin to lose their texture for anyone looking later. The case then suffered not only from initial uncertainty, but from the ordinary erosion of context. That erosion is one of the quiet engines of every cold case. Paper survives, meaning fades. A note written on one evening may have pointed clearly to something in that moment. Decades later, that same note may look like pure mystery because the local world around it has shifted out of reach. So when people ask why the YOGTZE case went cold, part of the answer lies here. Not in a single missed clue. In the way the available clues depended on context that was never firm enough at the start and only became weaker with time. The unknown men could not be fixed. The note could not be fixed to a named source. Once those three uncertainties settled into the file, everything else had to move around them. And then there was the question no investigator could avoid for long. How much weight should be given to Stoll's mental and emotional state in the period before his death? This is a delicate part of the case. It requires patience. It requires respect. Because to discuss distress is not to dismiss a person. It is simply to take seriously the reports of those who knew him. People around him had observed fear. They had heard him speak of unnamed pursuers. They had seen behavior that suggested deep unease. Police could not ignore that. At the same time, they could not allow concern about his state of mind to become a shortcut that explained away every external possibility. That balance is very difficult to keep. Lean too far one way, and a real threat may be overlooked. Lean too far the other, and every anxious statement becomes evidence of a conspiracy no one can prove. The investigators had to stand in the middle. That middle ground is not comfortable. It means saying, yes, he appeared distressed, and also saying, that distress does not tell us whether the feared danger was real, imagined, misperceived, or mixed. Cases with this kind of ambiguity often drift because each interpretive camp can explain some of the facts. If you emphasize psychology, the fear makes sense, the strange movements make some sense, and the note may become a fragment of disordered thought. But the unidentified men and the unusual roadside scene remain difficult. If you emphasize external threat, the statement about pursuers and the possible companions makes sense, and the note may become a cryptic attempt to identify danger. But then the absence of named enemies, clear motive, and usable suspects becomes the obstacle. Neither side closes the file. So the file remains open, and colder each year. This tension likely affected interviews with family, friends, and co-workers as well. People who knew him could offer atmosphere better than they could offer certainty. They could say whether he had seemed withdrawn, whether he had become more suspicious, whether work had gone badly, whether he had mentioned someone indirectly, whether money, health, or disappointment had been pressing on him. All of that matters. None of it is the same as hard proof. And in many unresolved cases, the distance between atmosphere and proof is the whole problem. Atmosphere tells you what kind of world the event emerged from. Proof tells you what happened. In the YOGTZE case, investigators had much more of the first than the second. That does not mean they had no evidence. It means the evidence was often evidentiary in the broad human sense, not in the narrow legal one. A wife hearing fear, a pub witness hearing a phrase, a note uncertain in form, an unexpected visit, a route into the night, a roadside scene with implications but not enough stable detail to produce a courtroom story. All of it matters. All of it falls short of closure. One useful way to see why the case went cold is to notice how every major line of inquiry reached a natural stopping point. The route could be traced, but only to a point. The note could be interpreted, but only to a point. The witness statements could be aligned, but only to a point. The search for people in his personal and professional world who might explain his fear could be pursued, but only to a point. Each line produced some order. None produced decisive narrowing. And an investigation without narrowing is an investigation that slowly loses heat. A hot case is not simply one with public attention. It is a case where each new step reduces the field. It turns many possibilities into fewer possibilities. It replaces speculation with names. It converts rumor into evidence. The YOGTZE case did almost the opposite. As more was learned, several explanations remained alive at once. That does not mean the detectives failed. It means the case structure itself resisted contraction. Even the place names in the file contributed to that strange effect. Anshausen, Siegerland, Hagen, the A45. These are solid anchors on a map. They give the night shape. But shape is not motive. A road can tell you where someone traveled. It cannot tell you why he believed he had to go. And because Stoll's movements looked intentional without becoming intelligible, the map became both helpful and limited. You could lay the route out with care. You still could not read its private meaning. That gap between root and reason may be one of the quietest, most stubborn features of the case. Years later, when later observers revisited the file, they often returned to one hope. Perhaps modern perspective or fresh eyes might see something older investigators missed. That hope is understandable. Sometimes old cases do yield to new thinking. A forgotten witness is found, a geographic pattern becomes clear. A coded phrase is reread in light of local knowledge. An archival document surfaces. But hope has to contend with the same material the original detectives had. And here, the material remained resistant. The note did not become clearer with repetition. The unknown men did not become easier to identify simply because decades had passed. In fact, time made both harder. Witnesses age, memories flatten, regional context disappears, and the line between what was genuinely reported and what later retellings added can grow dangerously thin. That last problem matters more than it first seems. When a case becomes famous for a clue, later summaries start selecting the same details. The complex, uncertain file becomes a simplified narrative. The simplification helps memory. It harms investigation. People remember the code word. They remember the phrase at the pub. They remember the alleged men, but they may not remember which part came from direct evidence, which from early reports, which from later reconstruction, and which from the natural tendency of mysteries to smooth themselves into stories. Police, by contrast, have to preserve roughness. They have to know what they know and how they know it. If the source of a detail is weak, the detail must remain weak no matter how compelling it sounds. This discipline can make real investigative work seem less satisfying than public mystery culture. But it is the only thing that keeps a difficult case from dissolving completely into imagination, so the YOGTZE case sat in that difficult place. It was memorable enough to attract constant interpretation. It was uncertain enough that interpretation could rarely be tested conclusively. That combination is almost designed to produce a long afterlife without a solution. If you step back from the famous note for a moment, another explanation for the case's coldness becomes visible. The final hours may have involved more than one separate problem overlapping. This is not a theory of what happened so much as a caution about how cases can become tangled. Suppose a person is already distressed. Suppose that person then travels, meets someone, or enters a situation that by itself is hard to reconstruct. The resulting file may contain clues from both the internal struggle and the external event. Later, investigators are left trying to sort which clue belongs to which layer. The note might belong to one layer, the route to another, the roadside scene to a third. If that is true, the case is not merely unsolved, it is structurally confusing. And structurally confusing cases go cold very easily, because every clue may be real without all the clues belonging to one clean chain. Police must have felt that pressure. Was the note about the men? Was the fear about the final encounter? Was the drive toward Hagen part of a plan or part of confusion? Did the visit to the elderly woman represent a search for comfort or an interrupted attempt to say something important? Each question matters. Yet each one may also belong to a different layer of the night. That possibility helps explain why so much effort produced so little decisive movement. The pieces may not have aligned neatly because they were never generated by one simple event. Still, investigators had to keep looking for concrete links. They reviewed acquaintances, they weighed patterns. They considered whether anyone in his circle had reason to avoid attention after that night. They likely examined whether vehicles, workplaces, or known associations overlapped with the rough shape of the note. They would have returned to the road, to timing, to travel estimates, because chronology is often the last strong tool when motive remains obscure. That is another quiet lesson in cold case work. When meaning fails, sequence becomes precious. What happened first? What happened next? What had to be true for the known locations to fit? What could not have happened if the timeline is respected? These are not dramatic questions. They are foundational. And once chronology became the main tool, every surviving inconsistency had to be handled with unusual care. A gap of even a few minutes could matter. A witness who was sure about a place but not a time could still be useful. A witness who was sure about a time but vague about what was seen could also be useful. Cold cases are often built from incomplete certainties like that, one partial truth leaning against another. In the YOGTZE case, though, those partial truths never fully locked together. That failure to lock is part of why the case cooled. It was not because the investigators lacked questions. It was because each answer seemed to open sideways rather than forward. If the route to Hagen was intentional, then someone or something had drawn him there. If it was not intentional in a planned sense, then it still reflected a choice made under pressure. Either way, the road mattered. But the road could not testify. The people who had seen parts of it could only offer fragments. So police had to keep turning back toward the life he had been living before the night began. That meant asking a set of difficult, ordinary questions. What had Gunther Stoll been worried about in the weeks before the 25th of October? Had anyone heard specific names? Had anyone noticed a pattern in his fears? Did his references to unnamed pursuers come after certain conversations, certain errands, certain days at work? Was there a trigger that repeated often enough to notice? You can feel the patience required in that work. No one clue announces itself. Instead, detectives sit with relatives, friends, and acquaintances, asking them to remember not the exceptional moment, but the everyday texture around it. Did he seem distracted? Did he avoid certain places? Did he mention debts? Did he speak about being watched? Did he complain about people at work? Did he seem more isolated than before? The answers appear to have remained unsatisfyingly broad. Concern? Yes. Something was wrong? Yes. But a concrete named conflict large enough to explain the final night never solidified. That is a serious investigative obstacle. In many long unsolved cases, The difference between mystery and progress is one simple noun: a person, a company, a street, a bar, a debt, a dispute. Here, so much remained at the level of pronouns: they, someone. Something. That vagueness does not make the fear less real. It makes the fear harder to examine. And it also puts pressure on those around the victim, because they are left trying to interpret statements that may have felt troubling at the time, but not yet actionable. A wife may hear anxiety, a friend may hear an odd remark, a co-worker may notice strain. No one realizes in the moment that decades later those observations will be treated like pieces of a larger archive. That is another quiet sadness in cases like this. The most important details are often noticed only after they are no longer fresh. There was also the matter of his profession, which later summaries often mention because it seems like it might connect to the note. He was a food engineer. That fact encourages interpretation. People hear a string like YOGTZE and immediately notice how the beginning resembles yogurt. It is a very human impulse. We look for associations that feel close to the life we already know about. Investigators would have done the same, but more carefully. If the note had any connection to his work, there would need to be something more than a sound. There would need to be a company, a product, a technical term, a known dispute, a contract, a shipment, a meeting, a place. There would need to be context. Without context, similarity remains only similarity. So the work became practical again. Who had he worked with? What businesses had crossed his path? What names, initials, and routines belonged to his professional world? Did any overlap naturally with the letters? Did any point toward Hagen or toward roads in that direction? Did any suggest why he might have believed people were after him? As far as the public record shows, no such line produced a firm answer. That does not mean no relevant connection existed. It means the connection, if it existed, did not become clear enough to use. That distinction is important. Many cold cases are not empty. They are crowded with possibilities that never become demonstrable. A hidden dispute can remain hidden forever if the people who knew about it stay silent, move away, or die. A private worry can remain private if it was never explained clearly enough to another person. An important workplace detail can disappear when records are routine rather than dramatic, and no one realizes at the time that they will one day matter. This is how a case can be both rich in speculation and poor in evidentiary leverage. The YOGTZE case sits very much in that space. Investigators also had to consider whether the fear that others remembered was itself changing over time. When people recall an old conversation after a tragedy, they naturally give it more significance. That is not dishonesty. It is memory responding to consequence. A remark that once sounded merely odd can later sound prophetic. A complaint can later sound like a warning. A private anxiety can later be remembered with sharper edges than it had in the moment. Police know this, so they have to ask not only what people remembered, but when they first reported it, how specifically they reported it, and whether later retellings may have strengthened it. This is one reason old cases often become harder rather than easier in public discussion. The narrative grows cleaner, the evidence does not. By the time the YOGTZE case was widely discussed as a mystery, some details had already acquired the stillness of legend. The phrase at the pub, the note, the fear of unnamed people, the elderly woman's house, the crash near Hagen, the unknown men. All of these are real elements, but the degree of certainty attached to each is not identical. A careful investigation has to keep that unevenness visible. Otherwise, the case becomes too smooth, and smooth stories are often the enemy of truth. This is where the practical limits of the inquiry began to show. To move the case forward, police needed one of several things: a witness strong enough to identify the other men, a convincing interpretation of the note that produced a testable lead, a concrete dispute in Stoll's personal or professional life, or physical evidence tying the final roadside scene to a clearly identifiable prior event or location. Without one of those, the investigation remains suspended between plausible directions. That suspension is not dramatic. It is administrative. Files remain active on paper. Tips can still arrive. The public can still remember. But day-to-day momentum slows. Detectives review rather than pursue. They compare rather than seize. The case does not stop. It settles. And once a case settles into that rhythm, every new theory must push harder to justify itself. The YOGTZE note especially suffered under that condition. Each new interpretation sounded possible at first. Then it met the same quiet question: what does this allow us to do? Can it name a person? Can it place a meeting? Can it explain the route? Can it illuminate the men? Can it clarify why the crash scene looked the way it did? Most theories, when tested that way, dissolved back into possibility. That is not failure of imagination, it is the proper boundary of evidence. There is a temptation in cases with a famous clue to believe that solving the clue would solve the case. Sometimes that is true. A decoded letter reveals a name, an unknown mark turns out to be a location. A forgotten acronym points to a hidden institution. But sometimes the clue is only one piece of a larger private logic. Even if YOGTZE could be decoded perfectly, it might not answer the larger question of what happened on the road. It might tell us what he was thinking about, but not who met him. It might point toward a fear, but not identify the people involved. It might reveal a place, but not the event that connected that place to his death. Investigators had to remain aware of that possibility, because otherwise too much weight would be placed on a clue that might be secondary. That, too, can cool a case. When a mystery has one especially memorable detail, it can distort the allocation of attention. The public circles the code. The detectives still have to do the slower work of geography, personal history, witness reliability, and evidentiary limits. The result is a curious split. One version of the case becomes cultural, the other remains procedural. The YOGTZE case has lived with that split for many years. If you sit quietly with the file, another feature becomes clear. The case may have gone cold not only because of what was unknown, but because of what was almost known. An entirely blank case can inspire broad searches. A case with partial but unstable answers can be more deceptive. It makes you feel close. The note almost says something. The route almost forms a plan. The witnesses almost identify companions. The victim almost explains his fear. That repeated nearness can consume enormous effort. Each time investigators may have thought, one more interview, one more comparison, one more reconstruction could tighten the whole thing. And each time the material loosened again in their hands. This is exhausting, especially in a pre-digital era. In 1984, casework depended heavily on paper files, phone calls, physical maps, local memory, in-person interviews, and the persistence of individual investigators. There were no mobile phone location records to reconstruct movement, no modern surveillance network to trace a vehicle from intersection to intersection, no digital communication trail to review later, no searchable databases that instantly cross-referenced every name, plate, and local business variation. That does not mean the investigation was primitive. It means it relied more heavily on the things that time damages most: memory and context. When people later ask why the case went cold, this historical setting matters. Detectives were doing careful work with the tools of their time. The case simply did not offer the kind of hard, recoverable traces that modern audiences often assume must exist. Consider what a modern inquiry might hope for in similar circumstances. Phone records, automatic camera captures, electronic payments, vehicle telemetry, location data, messages preserved in cloud archives. Even then, not every case is solved. But in a case like this, where so much depends on route and contact, those tools would have changed the shape of the inquiry dramatically. In 1984, if a man left home and drove through the night, much of his movement vanished the moment it happened. If he met others, and no one remembered them clearly, they vanished too. The surviving record was built mostly from witness recollection and physical scene analysis. That is enough in some cases. In this one, it was not enough to force resolution, so the file began to age. And with age, Another challenge entered: repetition. Investigators revisiting the case would encounter the same main pillars again and again. The phrase in the pub, the note, the fear, the unexplained stop, the route to Hagen, the crash scene, the possible other men. This repetition can be useful. It prevents drift into irrelevance. But it can also create a loop. Every new review starts from the same landmarks and ends near the same unknowns. That looping quality is one reason the case has remained haunting without becoming solvable. It is not empty, it is circular. There is also a human reason cases like this remain open in memory. People do not only want an answer to a puzzle, they want a proportionate story for a human life. When someone dies after an evening of visible fear, people naturally resist explanations that feel too thin. A simple accident seems too thin. Purely private distress without external contact seems too thin to some. An elaborate conspiracy, on the other hand, can seem too large for the evidence. So the mind keeps searching for a middle explanation, something real, human, and modestly terrible. Perhaps a meeting gone wrong, perhaps a fear rooted in some ordinary conflict, perhaps companions who panicked and fled, perhaps a clue written in haste that no one else knew how to read. These possibilities feel proportionate. They feel like they belong to the scale of the evidence, and yet none of them has been proved. That is why the case lingers. It is not because the imagination has no material, it is because it has too much material of the wrong kind. Not firm evidence, but suggestive evidence. Not closure, but contour. As the investigation matured, police would also have had to think about the consequences of publicity. Public attention can help. It can refresh memories. It can bring in overlooked witnesses. It can pressure silent people to talk. But publicity around a cryptic clue can also flood a case with interpretation. People begin seeing meaning everywhere. A local sign resembles the letters. A company acronym seems close. A product name half fits. A road marker can be rearranged. A rumor hardens into a supposed fact. The more a case enters public conversation, the more detectives must spend time filtering rather than discovering. They have to evaluate tips that are interesting but unusable. They have to separate early source material from later embellishment. They have to keep the file disciplined while the world around it grows imaginative. That filtering process is another hidden way a case can cool. Energy is spent maintaining clarity rather than gaining it. And in the YOGTZE case, clarity was already the central difficulty. Some investigators, in cases like this, begin to ask a gentler question. Not what single theory solves everything, but what minimum facts can be stated with confidence. That is often the wiser approach. So what remains when the speculation is set aside? A man in distress was seen at a local pub on the 25th of October, 1984. He apparently made a brief remark suggesting sudden understanding. He wrote down a short sequence of letters that later became known as YOGTZE, though the exact form appears to have been uncertain or altered. He returned home and told his wife that unnamed people were after him. He later drove away in his Volkswagen Golf. He made an unexpected late visit to an elderly woman he knew. He continued on toward the Hagen area. He was later found severely injured after a roadside event near the A45. There were indications from early accounts that other men may have been involved or present. He died without providing a complete usable explanation. Those facts are enough to establish a deeply troubling case. They are not enough to settle why it happened. That is the line the investigation kept reaching. And once that line had been reached several times, the case entered its colder phase. This does not mean detectives stopped caring. Cold cases are often sustained precisely because someone keeps caring quietly for a very long time. A file stays on a shelf, but not in oblivion. A name stays in an index. A note stays copied in summary reports. Periodically, someone reviews it again, sometimes because of media interest, sometimes because of a new investigator's attention, sometimes because unsolved cases have their own moral gravity. They remain. They ask, without speaking, whether anything else can still be done. In the YOGTZE case, the answer was likely yes, but only within narrowing bounds. Review the note again. Review the witness statements again. Review his contacts again. Ask whether any local knowledge overlooked at the time might shed light now. But each of those tasks had already been attempted in some form, so every reopening risked returning to the same point. This is what investigative drift looks like in practice. Not chaos, recurrence. One of the most difficult decisions in that colder phase would have concerned emphasis. Should the case be treated primarily as a suspicious death involving unknown others, or as a case in which a vulnerable man's distress may have shaped the evidence as much as any outside actor? That is not merely a philosophical distinction. It influences resources, interviews, and the tone of every review. If investigators lean strongly toward external foul play, they focus on suspects, vehicles, and hidden associates. If they lean strongly toward internal crisis, they focus on mental state, patterns of behavior, and the possibility that some elements of the night may not refer to the same thing. Most responsible investigators would try to keep both alive, but no file can carry equal attention to every possibility forever. Over time, practical judgment enters. Which line has produced something before? Which line still has room to produce something now? Which line is most consistent with the totality of known facts? The tragedy of the YOGTZE case is that none of those questions yielded a decisive winner. This helps explain why the case, though famous, did not produce a dramatic late revelation. There was no hidden confession surfacing from a locked drawer, no widely accepted decoding of the note, no identified group of companions stepping into the light, no recovered document tying the route to a planned meeting, at least not in any way that has settled the public record. Instead, the case remained an accumulation of unresolved relationships, the note to the mind of the writer, the fear to the people around him, the route to the possibility of a meeting, the crash scene to whatever preceded it, the alleged men to the broader question of whether his fear had an external basis. That network of relationships remained intact, but underdetermined, like a map with roads and names, but no legend. If you were the detective returning to the file after many years, perhaps that is where you would begin. Not by trying to solve YOGTZE in the abstract, not by trying to force one grand theory over every gap. You would begin with the smallest stable points, the known stops, the likely travel times, the direct statements, the earliest source of each claim, the exact wording where exact wording still exists, the caution around what may have been altered, crossed out, or misremembered. And then, very patiently, you would ask whether any modern understanding of local geography, local business, or local social ties changes the weight of those facts. This is not glamorous work, it is archival. But many cold cases survive only because someone is willing to do archival thinking with living compassion. Not to reduce a person to evidence, but to honor the unanswered parts of a life by handling them carefully. The YOGTZE case asks for that kind of handling. There is one more reason the case cooled that should not be overlooked. The event occurred across a social landscape that was ordinary enough to hide itself. This was not a famous city center crowded with cameras and institutional records. It was a network of towns, roads, local acquaintances, and nighttime movement through familiar regional space. In such places, much depends on who happened to notice what. A late visit can be remembered because it was unusual. A drive can go unrecorded because drives happen every day. A roadside scene can be seen only in fragments because those who arrive see aftermath, not cause. This ordinariness is part of what makes the case feel so persistent. Nothing about the setting is theatrical. The mystery grows out of familiar terrain. A pub table, a village home, a road toward Hagen, an autobahn area at night. The ordinary frame makes the unanswered details feel more intimate, and perhaps more stubborn. They seem like things that ought to have been knowable, and yet they were not. As years passed, journalists and viewers would continue returning to the same central symbol, YOGTZE itself. A handful of letters, a crossed out or altered note, a title for a mystery. But inside the file, those letters were never alone. They were attached to a man whose distress was visible. to people who cared about him but could not fully explain his fear, to investigators trying to decide how much of the night reflected deliberate action and how much reflected private confusion, to a roadside discovery that suggested outside involvement without identifying it, to all of that patient uncertainty. This is why the question of work, fear, and ordinary life mattered so much. Without that context, the note becomes almost mythical. With that context, it remains human. A human clue is often less satisfying than a mythic one. It is also more truthful. And that human context also explains why later reviews of the case kept returning to the same careful question: what exactly had the people around Günther Stoll truly known, and what had they only sensed? A sensed danger can feel heavy in memory. A known danger can be tested. That difference shaped the cold case more than almost anything else. His wife could report his fear, friends or acquaintances could report odd remarks. People at the pub could report a phrase that seemed to signal sudden understanding. But those reports did not convert themselves into a named person, a clear dispute, or a practical motive. So investigators were left with a difficult kind of truth. Something was wrong. No one could say with confidence what form that wrongness took. That uncertainty had consequences right away. It meant that when police tried to move outward from Stoll's daily life, they did not move along one strong line. They moved along several faint ones. One line led toward work, another led toward private worry, another led toward the possibility that his fear had attached itself to ordinary events in ways others had not recognized at the time. And because each of those lines remained plausible, the case never gained the hard narrowing that often carries an investigation through its early months. If you imagine the file in that stage, it is no longer only a record of one night. It is becoming a record of surrounding days and weeks. Investigators would have needed to know whether he had recently argued with anyone, whether he had become estranged from a colleague, whether he had mentioned a debt, a disappointment, or a practical problem, whether he had seemed preoccupied with a specific place or person, whether anyone had noticed him writing things down, making calls, or changing habits. This is the quiet part of detection that rarely draws much public attention. You do not search only for villains, you search for structure. A person under pressure often leaves a pattern behind, even if that pattern does not immediately explain the final event. In this case, though, the pattern seems to have remained more emotional than concrete. He was troubled. He was fearful. He appears to have believed that unnamed others were pursuing him. Yet those unnamed others never became clear enough to investigate as a stable group. That is one of the central reasons the case cooled in practice. Not only in theory. Police can investigate a person. They can investigate a workplace conflict. They can investigate a vehicle tied to a registration. It is much harder to investigate they. The pronoun is full of alarm. It is poor in direction. So the investigators had to ask whether any ordinary part of his life could supply missing direction. Work was a natural place to begin. He had trained and worked as a food engineer. That fact has often been repeated because it seems, at first glance, to cast a strange light on the note. But work mattered for broader reasons too. Professions create circles of contact. They create obligations, disappointments, rivalries, hopes, and embarrassments. Most of these are small. Sometimes one is not small. If there had been a dispute linked to his employment, it might have explained why the fear felt personal yet remained hard for family members to decode. A spouse may know that something at work is wrong without knowing names or specifics. A colleague may know a practical issue without knowing the emotional force it carried in private. So investigators likely had to compare impressions across different kinds of witness. What did family hear? What did acquaintances hear? What did anyone in his professional circle know? Did the same concern appear in more than one setting, under more than one description? Or did the fear remain frustratingly general wherever it was remembered? As far as the lasting public record goes, no single professional conflict emerged as the answer. That silence is meaningful. Not because it proves work was irrelevant, because it suggests that if work mattered, it did not matter in a way that became plainly documentable. A business dispute can fade very quickly if it was informal. A strained relationship can disappear from the record if no one thought to preserve it. A practical problem can seem too minor to mention until after a death, by which time the edges are already gone. That is one of the small sorrows inside many cold cases. What later looks crucial may once have seemed too ordinary to repeat carefully. And so investigators are often left interviewing people who remember the feeling of a problem, but not the exact content of it. That appears to have happened here again and again. People could sense unease. They could not translate that unease into a usable map. This is where the line between psychological explanation and external explanation became almost impossible to hold cleanly. If a man appears distressed, then some of his behavior may reflect internal pressure. That is simply true. If that same man then ends the night in circumstances suggesting contact with others, some of the behavior may also reflect an external event. That is also true. The difficulty is that those two truths can overlap, and when they do, a case becomes harder to read than a simpler mystery would be. The note may come from private thought. The drive may come from a real intention. The fear may be emotionally amplified but still tied to an actual person. The final roadside scene may involve others who did not create the fear but became part of the outcome. Once you allow for overlap, the case becomes more realistic. It also becomes much more resistant to closure. That resistance likely deepened as the months passed. Early in an investigation, uncertainty can still feel temporary. Detectives assume the next interview may settle things. The next local check may produce a name. The next careful comparison may reveal that one witness had noticed more than everyone realized. But when that process repeats without decisive return, the case changes texture. The work continues. The confidence changes. A detective starts to understand not just what is missing, but what kind of missingness the case contains. In the YOGTZE file, the missingness was not total. It was selective. The broad shape of the night could be outlined. The meaning inside it could not. That is much harder than a simple gap. A blank can always be hoped over. A half-filled page keeps drawing the eye back to what almost makes sense. So the case kept inviting reinterpretation. Each revisit asked whether the answer might lie not in some dramatic hidden enemy, but in the subtle connections between his routine life and that final journey. Perhaps someone near him had seemed harmless and was not. Perhaps a practical issue had acquired a private intensity no one fully understood. Perhaps his fear had latched on to a real but ordinary conflict, one too small to appear important in later retellings. Investigators had to remain open to these quieter possibilities. The trouble was that quieter possibilities often leave the lightest evidence. A major criminal enterprise leaves records, trails, associates, patterns. A modest personal conflict may leave almost nothing once time begins its slow work. And time had already begun that work very quickly. Each passing week made witness memory softer. Each passing month made small contextual details harder to verify. Shops changed, routes shifted in local memory, workplace references lost freshness. Conversations that had once carried tone and gesture became summaries. Cold cases are shaped by that erosion as much as by the original event. You can see it clearly in a clue like the note. The note did not simply remain ambiguous. Its ambiguity grew heavier because the world around it receded. A local product name that might once have been obvious can become obscure. A workplace shorthand can vanish when the people who used it stop using it. A passing road reference can lose its relevance when no one is certain which route the writer had in mind. So even if YOGTZE once pointed to something immediate and practical, the lapse of years made that practical context harder and harder to recover. That is why the case's coldness cannot be blamed on one missed insight. It was produced by accumulation, an uncertain note, uncertain companions, uncertain motive. A distressed victim who died before he could clarify anything. A route with stops that looked intentional but did not explain themselves. Each uncertainty pressed against the others. Together they slowed the file. There is another point worth sitting with for a moment. In many cold cases, investigators can rely on one category of evidence to stabilize the rest. If the witnesses are uncertain, perhaps the physical evidence is strong. If the physical evidence is limited, perhaps the motive is clear. If motive is weak, perhaps communications reveal intent. In the YOGTZE case, every major category appears to have been compromised in some way. Witnesses offered meaningful but incomplete memories. Physical circumstances suggested complexity, but not enough to reconstruct it fully. Motive remained diffuse, and communication, instead of clarifying the case, gave it its most famous ambiguity. That combination is rare enough to matter. It means there was no single evidentiary pillar strong enough to support the whole structure. Without such a pillar, the investigation had to balance itself across several weaker supports. That can be done for a time. It is difficult to sustain for years. So when people later ask why the case became one of Germany's enduring mysteries, this is part of the answer. It had enough detail to be unforgettable. It did not have enough fixed detail to become solvable. That distinction matters. Some unsolved cases fade because there is too little to hold on to. This one endured because there was just enough to return to and never quite enough to finish. The route itself played a quiet role in that endurance. From Anshausen into the night toward Hagen, the movement has a kind of narrative clarity. You can picture it. A man leaves a pub unsettled. He goes home. He speaks of unnamed pursuers. He makes an odd late visit. He drives on. Then comes the roadside event. The sequence feels coherent. But coherent is not the same as explained. The route seduces interpretation because it looks like a progression. Perhaps he was going to meet someone. Perhaps he was fleeing something. Perhaps he was trying to reach safety. Perhaps he was trying to confirm what he believed he had suddenly understood. Each possibility fits the broad motion. None is anchored strongly enough by the surviving evidence. And because the route can support several stories at once, it does not narrow the file. It enlarges it. That is another reason the case resisted closure. Even movement, usually one of the most clarifying parts of an inquiry, remained open to contrary readings. The stop at the elderly woman's house is a good example of this. If you view the night as an effort to seek help, the stop looks like a brief attempt to place himself near someone familiar. If you view the night as a purposeful trip toward a meeting, the stop might look like a pause, a hesitation, a detour taken under strain. If you view the night through the lens of internal confusion, the stop can seem like the instinctive move of someone drifting toward a known place without a clear plan. All three interpretations are possible. The trouble is that the stop itself did not produce the extra statement or clarification needed to distinguish among them, so it remains significant but unstable. The same pattern follows almost every major element in the case. It matters, it does not settle. That recurring structure gradually turns an active investigation into a reflective one. The emphasis shifts, not away from facts, but toward the limits of facts. A detective revisiting the file is no longer only asking what happened. He is also asking what can still be responsibly said. That is a different mood. It is slower, more restrained, less hopeful in a dramatic sense, though not without care. And that may be the most honest way to sit with an old mystery like this, not as a locked room awaiting one brilliant key, as a human event whose available traces may never have been enough to yield a complete account. Even so, the case did not vanish. It stayed in memory and later in public discussion because certain unanswered points continued to press on anyone who reviewed it carefully. What did he believe he had suddenly understood at the pub? Why write the note at all? Why alter it? Why return home only to leave again? Why visit that particular older woman late at night? Why head in the direction of Hagen? Who, if anyone, were the other men? And how should the final roadside scene be interpreted? As primary, or as the end of something that had happened elsewhere? Those are not merely decorative questions. They are the framework of the case. You can rearrange theories inside them. You cannot escape them. As years passed, the file would have entered the familiar rhythm of a long unsolved case. There would be periods of quiet, then renewed attention. A journalist might revisit it. A television program might summarize it. A new generation might encounter the note and feel the old pull of the letters. Each time the same double effect would occur. Interest would return, certainty would not. That is the peculiar life of an unresolved mystery. It remains vivid in culture while staying motionless in evidence. For the investigators, that kind of afterlife can be frustrating. Public memory tends to sharpen the most unusual detail. Professional memory tends to hold on to the hardest limitation. The public says, surely the note means something. The file says perhaps, but perhaps not in a way that can now be recovered. The public says the unknown men must be central. The file says, maybe, but we do not have enough to make that conclusion safe. Both reactions are understandable. They simply operate at different thresholds. One is narrative. The other is evidentiary. In the colder years of the YOGTZE case, that difference likely widened. A famous clue encourages confidence. An old file teaches caution. And caution can look unsatisfying from the outside, yet it is often the only ethical way to preserve a difficult case. To overstate certainty would be to invent resolution where none exists. To discard the case altogether would be to give up on what can still be known. So the middle path remains. Careful restatement, periodic review, disciplined curiosity. That middle path is patient work. It is also why the file still matters. You can feel this patience most clearly in the way investigators and later analysts kept circling back to chronology. Even when motive remained unclear, the timing of events still offered one of the few dependable tools. How long after the pub did he return home? How long before he left again? How much time could reasonably have elapsed before the unexpected visit? How much road remained between that stop and the final location? Was there enough time for a meeting elsewhere? If so, where? Was there enough time for a detour not captured in the broad public narrative? If so, what kind? Chronology does not solve a mystery by itself, but it can rule out fantasies. That is valuable. In a case that attracts endless interpretation, ruled out fantasies are a form of progress. They clear the ground. They remind us that not every possible story fits the available night. Still, chronology has limits too. A timeline can show there was room for an encounter. It cannot prove there was one. A timeline can show that a direct drive seems unlikely. It cannot tell you what occupied the extra time. A timeline can suggest that another party may have been involved. It cannot identify them. And so even the strongest procedural tool in the case returned investigators to the same threshold. Enough to question, not enough to close. One consequence of this was investigative drift back toward the most stable things in Stoll's life. Family, home, routine, work history, known acquaintances. Not because those areas were more dramatic, because they were the only places where context might still be reconstructed with some care. When clues become unstable, ordinary life becomes the archive. That archive is imperfect. People remember relationships unevenly. They often protect the dead from painful interpretation. They may minimize conflict without meaning to. They may inflate signs of trouble after the fact. Police know this, and yet they must work there anyway. There is nowhere else to go. In the YOGTZE case, that meant asking the people around him to carry a burden no witness ever wants. To speak about a troubled person they loved or knew, while accepting that some of what they say may later be weighed as explanation, that is hard. It is especially hard when the distinction between sympathy and analysis becomes thin. To say that someone seemed fearful is compassionate and factual. To ask whether that fear reflected mental disturbance, external danger, or both is necessary. But it changes the temperature of the conversation. Cold case work often lives in that changed temperature. Quiet, respectful, and still unavoidably probing. There was, too, the question of whether any person in his wider circle had remained in the background simply because their connection seemed too ordinary to notice. This happens more often than people think. Investigations naturally focus on obvious categories first: family, close friends, work associates, known disputes. But some events are shaped by looser ties, a casual acquaintance, someone from a local pub circuit, A person known through travel, routine errands, or a past job. A name heard before but never emphasized. These weaker links are difficult because they leave fewer records and inspire less immediate suspicion. If the answer to the YOGTZE case lay somewhere in that outer ring, the chances of recovering it would have dropped quickly once the first period of urgency passed. That possibility helps explain the lasting unease around the case. The missing piece may not be grand, it may be small, local, and ordinary, and therefore largely unrecoverable now. Cold cases often turn on that paradox. The decisive fact is not hidden because it is elaborate. It is hidden because no one knew at the time that it needed preserving. And when preservation fails, later investigators are left with atmospheres, not anchors. By now, the public identity of the case had become inseparable from the note, "That is understandable." A mystery with letters has a visible emblem. But if you look at the case from the investigator's side, the file is really about a chain of incomplete translations. A man's fear is translated by those who heard it. A written fragment is translated by those who saw or repeated it. A route is translated by estimated movement between confirmed points. A final roadside event is translated by witnesses who encountered aftermath, not origin. Every part of the case reaches us through mediation. That does not make it false. It makes it fragile. And fragile cases rarely collapse all at once. They cool slowly. One unresolved question after another settles into the record without hardening into evidence. This is why, in the years after the original investigation, the YOGTZE case became less an active pursuit and more an enduring file of tested possibilities. Not because police had no interest, because practical avenues had been walked as far as they could go. The note had been worried over. The route had been reconstructed as far as available information allowed. Witness statements had been compared, the personal and professional background had been explored, and still, the core elements remained unsettled. At that point, a case does not end. It enters a new posture. It waits. Sometimes waiting changes nothing. Sometimes time produces one small thing: a witness willing to speak, a family memory shared, a forgotten local reference recognized, a document rediscovered. But waiting is a passive tool. It cannot manufacture evidence. So the YOGTZE file stayed in that long suspended state, open in principle, static in practice. The emotional consequence of this should not be overlooked. For a family, an unsolved case does not remain abstract. The unanswered questions recur at odd moments. A phrase heard years ago becomes newly troubling. A routine object acquires strange significance. A night drive that once seemed unimaginable becomes the fixed center of memory. And because the YOGTZE case contains so many small, unresolved acts, writing a note, speaking a phrase, making an unexpected visit, it likely left behind not just grief, but a series of private puzzles for those closest to him. That human residue is part of why patient detective work matters, even when it does not produce a final public answer. It acknowledges that unanswered does not mean unimportant. It keeps the file from collapsing into folklore entirely. Still, folklore has a way of growing around such cases. A simple phrase becomes sharper in retelling. A clue becomes more stable than it really was. A night's uncertainty becomes a cleaner narrative arc. That process is almost inevitable. People want stories to hold still. The YOGTZE case resists holding still. What keeps drawing careful people back is not just the note itself, but the arrangement around it. A clue can stay unresolved for decades and still feel almost close enough to touch. That was the lasting shape of this case. Not emptiness, but near meaning. Not silence exactly, but speech that never became clear enough to use. So as the years passed, the YOGTZE case settled into the particular rhythm old investigations often take. There would be renewed interest, then long quiet. A newspaper would revisit the route. A television segment would summarize the known facts. Someone would ask again whether the letters had ever been read correctly. Someone else would wonder whether the wrong part of the night had become central. And each return, however sincere, had to begin from the same narrow foundation. The phrase, "at the pub," the altered note, the fear at home, the unexpected visit, the drive toward Hagen, the final roadside discovery, the possible presence of other men. Nothing in that list disappeared, nothing in that list fully resolved. That is why the case became cold, in a practical sense. The file stayed alive in memory, but it stopped producing reduction. Reduction is what detectives need. They need 10 possibilities to become 4, then 4 to become 2, then 2 to become 1. In this case, the opposite often happened. A clue inspired one theory, then another, then another. A witness statement suggested a path, then opened a second path beside it. The note seemed to narrow the field until its instability widened it again. And because that pattern repeated, the case held attention without yielding direction. There is a patient sadness in that kind of file. The detectives are not looking at nothing. They are looking at too many things that remain partly plausible. A cold case unit, or any investigator reviewing old material, has to ask a blunt question. What can still be acted on? Not what is interesting, not what is haunting. What can still produce movement? In the YOGTZE case, that question would have led back to the same 3 regions of inquiry. First, the timeline. Second, the note. Third, the people around Günther's stall. Each region had promise. Each had limits. The timeline could still be tested against geography. Roads do not forget, even if drivers do. Distances remain what they were. Travel times can still be estimated. You can still ask how long it would have taken to go from Anshausen to the elderly woman's home, and from there toward Hagen. You can still ask where there was room for one more stop, one more meeting, one more unseen event. That work matters because time windows are often stronger than memories. A person may misremember tone. A road segment is less forgiving. If a theory requires too much time, the map quietly refuses it. And yet chronology, useful as it is, did not rescue this case. It showed where uncertainty lived. It did not dissolve it. There was room in the night for more than the public story could firmly describe. That was significant. But room is not proof. It only tells you that something more could have happened. Not what it was. The note, meanwhile, kept pulling the investigation back toward interpretation. It is easy to understand why. A short written fragment can feel like the one deliberate thing left behind. It can seem almost intimate, as if the writer leaned toward the future for 1 second and tried to hand over a key. But detectives have to distrust that feeling a little. A note is not always a key. Sometimes it is a scrap from a thought that never completed itself. Sometimes it is meaningful in a way that dies with the person who wrote it, and sometimes, worst of all for an investigation, it is meaningful and unreadable at the same time. That appears to be the place where YOGTZE remained, important enough to revisit, unstable enough to resist becoming evidence. Then there were the people around him. This part of the file may be the most human, and also the most limited. Family members, friends, acquaintances, local contacts, former co-workers, all of them could contribute texture. They could say what had changed. They could say he seemed afraid. They could say the fear was not invented later out of whole cloth. That mattered. It established that the unease visible on the final night had roots earlier in time. But even that useful fact led to a familiar problem. A pattern of fear is not the same as a named source of fear. If he had spoken more concretely, the investigation might have narrowed. If he had identified one person, one argument, one place, one grievance, then detectives could have moved with more confidence. But he did not leave that kind of plain trail behind. Or if he did, it was not recognized in time. And so the people in his life became witnesses to atmosphere more than witnesses to explanation. That is often how cold cases harden, not through dramatic failure, through the inability to convert atmosphere into a usable line of inquiry. You can imagine later investigators sitting with summaries from the original case and asking careful, almost modest questions. Did anyone in Stoll's wider social circle own a vehicle that fit part of the note, if the note was a registration fragment? Did any local company, product, or place known to him naturally match the letters? Did any person connected to his work have ties toward Hagen or reasons to be there? Did the elderly woman recall some nuance in his visit that had not seemed important at first? Had any witness report about the roadside scene been overstated in later retellings or understated in the original confusion? These are the right kinds of questions. But right questions do not guarantee useful answers, and with each passing year, the chance of finding fresh answers declines a little more. That is another quiet reason the case stayed cold. It was not only that evidence had been ambiguous, it was that the best people to clarify it were always moving farther away from the moment. Memory changes, not always by erasing, sometimes by smoothing. A person once remembered as deeply frightened may later be remembered as certain. A phrase once repeated cautiously may later be quoted too cleanly. A clue once understood as uncertain may later be retold as fixed. That smoothing process is dangerous in old mysteries. It makes the story easier to tell. It makes the case harder to solve. Because if the roughness disappears, investigators can begin trusting things they should still be handling with care. The YOGTZE case depended on preserving that roughness. The note may not have been exactly what later culture repeated. The witnesses may not have meant all that later summaries placed on them. The unknown men may have been central or peripheral or misunderstood. Those uncertainties are not defects in the telling, they are the case itself. And once you accept that, the coldness of the file starts to make more sense. It was never one locked door, it was a hallway of partly open doors, none leading all the way through. There is also the larger historical fact. 1984 was not a time that quietly archived every movement a person made. A drive through the night could vanish into darkness the moment it happened. There were no routine digital traces to gather later, no mobile location history, no searchable communication records in the modern sense, no ordinary net of cameras waiting at every turn. If a man drove from one town to another, met someone briefly, and left no written record of the meeting, much of that event depended on witness memory from the very start. That made the original investigation more difficult. It also made later review more fragile. Modern audiences often approach old cases with assumptions formed by newer tools. Surely there must be a record. Surely someone could retrace the route exactly. Surely a key detail must still be stored somewhere. But in a case like this, much of what mattered lived in passing human attention. Who noticed the car? Who remembered the time? Who heard the phrase? Who thought the note worth preserving? Who understood, too late, that an ordinary-seeming detail had been part of an extraordinary night? When you place the YOGTZE case inside that older, investigative world, the patient labor becomes easier to appreciate. The police were not overlooking easy answers hidden in plain digital sight. They were working with roads, statements, paper, and judgment. They were trying to stabilize a case in which the victim's own words and movements seemed to be pointing somewhere without ever arriving there. That is hard work, and it often leaves behind a file that looks thin from the outside, even when a great deal of effort went into it. Something else should be said here too. The public fascination with the YOGTZE note can accidentally shrink the rest of the case. It can make the mystery sound like a code waiting to be cracked. But for investigators, the note was only one part of a wider pattern. Even if someone could prove tomorrow what the letters referred to, that might not be enough. It might tell us something he noticed, something he feared, something he intended to remember. But it might still not explain who, if anyone, was with him later. It might still not explain the sequence that ended near the A45. It might still not explain whether the final roadside scene was the central event or only the visible endpoint of something that occurred elsewhere. That distinction matters. A famous clue can become too large. It can cast a shadow over the ordinary, slower questions that mattered just as much. Where was he really going? Who did he expect to see? Why did he stop where he stopped? What did the people around him truly know, and what were they only trying to reconstruct afterward? Those questions are quieter than a cryptic note. they are also closer to how real cases are solved. By now, the file had become what many old cases become, a record of repeated responsible attention. That phrase may sound modest, but it matters. A cold case is not only a mystery waiting for brilliance, it is often a record of people doing their best not to let uncertainty turn careless, reviewing statements again, comparing versions again, checking whether a rumor rests on an original source or only on repetition, asking whether a theory actually reduces the field or only sounds satisfying. That sort of discipline is easy to overlook. It does not produce dramatic scenes, but it is what protects both the dead and the living from being turned into convenient fiction. In the YOGTZE case, that discipline may be one reason no neat solution has ever taken hold officially. There are theories, certainly. Some place the weight on psychological distress, some place it on foul play. Some imagine a meeting gone wrong. Some assume the note refers to a place, or a product, or a registration. Some think the answer lies in his work. Others think the answer lies in one brief encounter never properly identified. But theories are not the same as closure. Theories can arrange the pieces. They cannot strengthen weak pieces into strong ones. And that was always the central limitation here. If you look at the case as a detective rather than as a viewer, one of the hardest things to accept is that the most memorable facts may still not connect in the way people expect. The phrase "at the pub" may matter deeply, or only partly. The note may refer to the later events, or to something adjacent. The fear of unnamed pursuers may reflect external danger, or a private interpretation of events that others never understood. The unknown men may be central, or they may belong to one slice of the story, not the whole of it. A single real night can contain several layers. When those layers survive only in fragments, the case can seem to contradict itself. That is not always because someone lied. Sometimes it is because the event itself was not simple enough to leave behind one clean account. This possibility, more than almost anything, explains why the investigation had trouble maturing into a solved structure. A simple case narrows, a layered case drifts, and drift, over time, becomes coldness. Still, even in that colder stage, there were certain unresolved points that kept the file from disappearing. One was the issue of the unidentified companions, if there were men with him, or near him, or involved before the public discovery of the scene. Then they represented the clearest bridge between his earlier fear and the final event. That made them crucial. It also made their absence from the record devastating. No names, no firm identities, no solid route from suspicion to person. Without that bridge, every other fact had to stand more or less alone. The note had to carry too much. His fear had to carry too much. The route had to carry too much. And when clues are forced to carry more than they can support, cases remain open and unresolved. Another unresolved point was the stop at the elderly woman's house. That visit kept resisting simplification. It was not random enough to ignore. It was not clear enough to decode. It suggested intention. It did not reveal intention. A man under pressure had gone there for some reason. Whether the reason was comfort, warning, hesitation, or confusion, no later summary has been able to settle. That one stop contains the whole emotional weather of the case. Purpose without explanation. A movement that matters and cannot be translated. Then there is Hagen itself. Or rather, the direction toward Hagen. In many cases, a destination can be treated like a statement. If someone drives toward a place, the place offers a clue. But here, the meaning of the route remained incomplete. Was Hagen the point? Was it only along the way? Did he expect to meet someone in that region? Did the road become important only after some intervening event? Again, the map gives shape, but not certainty. And because the route could not be tied securely to motive, geography stayed descriptive rather than decisive. That is one reason investigators kept circling the same broad territory without finding a final anchor. By the time the file had aged into public legend, one small irony had become clear. The case was remembered because it seemed full of clues, yet each famous clue had a built-in weakness. The note was famous but unstable. The phrase was famous but brief. The companions were famous but unidentified. The fear was famous but unnamed. The route was famous but open to several interpretations. In some mysteries, one great clue lights the way. Here, several half-clues lit just enough to keep the darkness from becoming complete. That may be why people still return to it. The case does not close the door. It leaves it ajar, enough to see shapes, not enough to know them. For detectives, though, that kind of case creates a specific burden. You cannot close it with confidence. You cannot solve it with romance. You can only keep separating what is documented from what is assumed. And over the years, that distinction becomes the real work. What is direct, what is reported, what is later interpretation, what began in the earliest file, and what was added by decades of retelling. That sorting process may sound almost clerical. In truth, it is moral. It is a way of refusing to let uncertainty harden into false certainty just because the mystery is old. So when we ask why the YOGTZE case went cold, the answer is not one thing. It is the interaction of many small restraints. A central witness who died, a clue that became famous before it became stable, a route that implied intention without disclosing it. Witnesses who could remember concern more easily than names. Possible companions who were never fixed in the record. A historical moment that preserved far less than modern investigations often can. And an event whose visible elements may have belonged to more than one underlying problem. Each of those factors alone might have been survivable. Together they made resolution increasingly unlikely. Still, the file did not become meaningless. Far from it. Patient investigation did produce something of value, even without a final answer. It established the broad sequence of the night. It preserved the fact that his fear had been visible beforehand. It prevented the case from collapsing into a simplistic accident account. It also prevented it, just as importantly, from becoming a fantasy unconstrained by evidence. That middle achievement deserves notice. To keep a difficult case accurately unresolved is a form of care. It preserves the truth of uncertainty. And uncertainty, though unsatisfying, is often more honorable than a forced ending. If you imagine the file lying open years later, the pages would not be dramatic. They would be full of names, roads, times, statements, maybe sketches of movement, maybe copied versions of the note, maybe remembered phrases set down with caution. That is what old mysteries often look like in reality. Paper trying to hold what vanished in motion. The YOGTZE case, for all its later fame, remained exactly that kind of case. A human life passing through ordinary places. A pattern of fear no one could fully translate. A final journey made up of choices that still seem deliberate, even now. And behind all of it, the quiet insistence of unanswered questions. Questions that did not disappear simply because time passed. Questions that may never be settled and yet continue to deserve careful handling. That is why later investigators and observers kept returning to the same arrangement of details, almost in a circle. Not because they enjoyed mystery for its own sake, but because the case offered the rare combination of emotional clarity and evidentiary blur. You could feel that something mattered. You could not quite prove what. A man had been afraid. A note had been written. A route had been taken. Other people may have been involved. He died before the story could be made plain. Those are not small things. They are simply not enough. And old cases are full of that painful sentence. Not enough to accuse, not enough to forget. So the YOGTZE case remained where many long unsolved files remain, between memory and proof, alive enough to be reopened. Thin enough to resist closure, quiet enough that every later telling had to decide whether to preserve the uncertainty or smooth it away. The most honest tellings keep the uncertainty. They leave room for the possibility that the final answer, if one ever existed in recoverable form, was lost not because no one cared, but because the essential context never held long enough. A few spoken words, a few written letters, a road at night, a series of stops, a stretch of time that widened instead of narrowing. That was the architecture of the mystery. And once that architecture was in place, the case could only move so far, without something new entering it, something firmer, a witness with detail, a record with context, a connection that was more than suggestive. Without that, the investigation could still revisit, it could still compare, it could still clarify the limits of old assumptions, but it could not cross the final distance. And so the letters remained where they had always been, not just as a possible clue, but as a reminder of everything else that stayed unresolved around them. If there was any final practical lesson in the way the case cooled, it was this. The unresolved center was never only linguistic, it was relational. Who knew him well enough to understand what frightened him? Who crossed his path that evening? Who, if anyone, rode with him, met him, or left him before the scene became public? Who might have recognized the note instantly in 1984, but never realized that recognition would matter? Those are relationship questions. And relationship questions grow more difficult with time, because they depend on webs of ordinary life. Ordinary life does not archive itself very well. People assume there will be another conversation, another chance to ask, another evening to make sense of what seemed odd. Then a death occurs, and all the ordinary threads suddenly matter. By then, some have already slipped away. That was the deeper coldness of the YOGTZE case. Not simply that a clue went undecoded, that the human network around it never became clear enough, soon enough to carry the truth forward. And that leaves the file in a very particular state, not sealed, not solved, not abandoned. Just waiting still in the careful language of old investigation for something that can turn possibility into fact. That waiting did